Texas, December 1944. The first light of dawn slid across the flat plains like a slow-moving tide, brushing the horizon in soft gold. The air was cold enough to bite, yet carried the faint warmth of something cooking, something rich, alive, and impossible to ignore. Inside a wooden mess hall wrapped in barbed wire, the scent of bacon curled through the air, mingling with the crackle of a griddle and the low murmur of men waking from uneasy dreams. German prisoners of war shuffled into line, thin, pale, their grey uniforms stiff with dust from another world. Their eyes were dull, hollowed by months of retreat, defeat, and disbelief. They had expected punishment. They had expected cruelty. What they hadn't expected was the smell of breakfast. For a moment, even the American guards fell silent. The only sounds were the pop of grease and the hum of a country tune sung by a cook in a sweat-stained cowboy hat. His boots scuffed the floor as he flipped eggs with easy rhythm, humming like a man who'd never known fear. Carl Weiss, 23, once a panzer mechanic from Dresden, stood frozen at the counter. The cook looked up, grinning beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Morning, partner," he drawled, sliding a plate toward him. On it sat scrambled eggs, 2 thick slices of toast, and bacon. Real bacon, golden and glistening with fat, still sizzling from the pan. The smell hit Carl like a memory from another life. He hesitated, eyes darting between the food and the man who served it. "Go on." "Son," the cook said, his accent rolling slow and easy. "Ain't no poison in it." Carl took the plate, his hands trembling as if the weight of kindness was heavier than steel. He sat at a long wooden table among men too stunned to speak. When he lifted the first strip of bacon to his lips, the crunch echoed louder than any gunshot. Salt, fat, warmth, flavors that spoke of home, of a world before smoke and rubble. His throat tightened. Tears came before he could stop them. Across the table, another prisoner muttered, "It's propaganda." But Carl knew better. No propaganda tasted like this. As he ate, he dared to glance up. The cook caught his eye again and winked. A simple human gesture that cracked something open inside him. Back in Dresden, Carl had believed every word on the posters. Americans were monsters, merchants of greed, soulless invaders. But here in a Texas mess hall wrapped in barbed wire, a cowboy with a spatula and a grin had just undone years of indoctrination with a single plate of bacon. Outside, the American flag flapped lazily in the morning breeze. Somewhere beyond the fence, a horse neighed, and the sound blended with the hiss of grease and the quiet murmurs of men relearning what it meant to be human. In that moment, Carl Weiss realized something his commanders never understood. America didn't just fight with bullets. It fought with breakfast. It began in the grey ruins of Normandy. The air was thick with the smell of wet soil and burnt steel, the kind of smell that clings to memory. Carl Weiss and what remained of his panzer unit had been cornered by American infantry near a shattered village whose name he would never remember. Their weapons lay scattered in the mud, their pride already surrendered before their hands were. For the first time in years, Carl wasn't a soldier, just another man in a torn uniform, exhausted and hungry. The Americans moved among them calmly, rifles low, eyes alert but not cruel. They offered rations, real food, canned meat, bread, coffee so strong it stung his nose. He expected humiliation, maybe blows, maybe worse. But instead, one young American handed him a tin of beans and said, "Eat up, fella. Long road ahead." That road began with trucks rumbling toward the coast. As they drove through shattered towns, Carl stared through the slats of the truck at faces along the road. French, Belgian, Dutch. No hatred in their eyes now, only emptiness. The war had stolen even anger from them. For the first time, Carl wondered if he had been on the wrong side of history. Days later, they were herded onto a massive steel ship. A Liberty ship, the Americans called it. Its hull gleamed like a floating factory, built not for glory, but for efficiency. Inside, the air was heavy with salt and oil, and the steady hum of engines vibrated through the metal floor. "Don't worry, boys," one American sailor called from above. "You're heading somewhere warm." The prisoners laughed bitterly. Prison was prison, warm or cold. But when the ship entered New York Harbor, silence fell. The skyline rose out of the mist like a dream. towers of glass and steel untouched by bombs. Docks teemed with cranes and workers, and ships moved in orderly lines like clockwork. There were no ruins here, no ration lines, no desperation. America was alive, thriving. Carl pressed his fingers against the railing, his heart pounding with something that felt dangerously close to awe. Everything he had been told about this country was collapsing before his eyes. From there, they boarded trains bound west. For days, the train rolled through an endless panorama: green forests, golden plains, distant mountains. Towns flashed by where children waved at the passing cars, where people smiled instead of scowled. It was unbearable. In Germany, children hid in bunkers. Here they played baseball, Carl whispered to the man beside him. They build faster than we can destroy. The man only nodded, staring out the window at the passing abundance. The farms, the silos, the rows of shining automobiles. When the train finally crossed into Texas, the landscape opened like an ocean, vast, sun-baked and alive with wind and cattle. The horizon stretched forever, the air shimmering with heat. Even the soil looked rich, full of life. At first, Carl thought the guards were joking when they spoke of ranch breakfasts and steaks thicker than your hand. But then he saw the camp. Clean, whitewashed barracks, wide-open yards, neat fences lined with barbed wire more out of order than menace. Inside, men received clean bunks, soap, and medical checks. The guards smiled as they handed out plates piled high with food. Bread, vegetables, meat, milk, even coffee, real coffee. That night, as Carl lay on his bunk, swing music drifted through the loudspeakers. Trumpets, drums, the rhythm bright and alive. It was a sound the Reich had banned, a sound that felt like rebellion and freedom wrapped into one. Carl closed his eyes and listened, and a strange thought stirred in him, quiet and unsettling. Maybe America didn't need to destroy Germany to win. Maybe it only needed to show it what freedom looked like. The mornings in Texas began with sound. It was not the sharp crack of gunfire or the metallic groan of tanks, those belonged to another life, but a softer rhythm. The distant rumble of a generator, the scrape of boots on gravel, the clatter of tin trays. Every day at dawn, before the sun had fully broken over the mesquite trees, the camp stirred awake with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Carl Weiss often woke before the bugle call, his body still wired to the habits of a soldier. He would lie on his cot, staring at the wooden ceiling, watching faint patterns of dust drift through the beams of first light. The air was dry and smelled faintly of soap and sawdust. For a moment between sleep and waking, he could almost pretend he was back in the barracks near Dresden, before the fire, before the ruins, before everything he thought he knew about the world had burned away. Then came the bell. The clank of metal on metal, breakfast. The barracks rustled to life. Men pulled on their worn uniforms. The same grey fabric that had once symbolized power and order, but now only marked them as captives. There was a quiet discipline to their movements, remnants of an army that no longer existed. And Carl sometimes thought of it as a kind of ghost parade. An army of the defeated, still marching out of habit even after the war had spat them out. Outside, the Texas morning was sharp and bright. The air shimmered faintly with heat even at dawn, carrying the smell of dust and the sweet tang of hay from nearby fields. The camp stretched out in clean, geometric lines. Barracks on one side, a mess hall at the center, a workshop, and the watchtowers that loomed like sentinels of reason rather than menace. The Americans didn't shout or threaten. Their rifles stayed slung over their shoulders. The barbed wire glinted in the sun, but somehow it felt less like a cage and more like a boundary between two ways of seeing the world. When Carl first arrived, that unnerved him more than cruelty ever could. Cruelty he understood. Mercy he did not. At breakfast, the same cook from that first morning, Tom Tex Hargrove, was already at his post. He was a broad man with sun-browned arms, his sleeves rolled high, and his voice carrying over the din of the mess hall. He hummed as he worked, sometimes a hymn, sometimes a swing tune, his movements fluid, unhurried. He treated food the way some men treated prayer. "Morning, boys," he'd say, ladling eggs and potatoes onto trays. "Ain't no shame in eating good when the sun's up." Most of the prisoners still avoided his gaze. Some muttered under their breath in German, half curses, half prayers. But Carl found himself studying the man, the way he moved through the steam and noise with easy confidence, as though the world beyond this camp could never touch him. There was something in that steadiness that unsettled Carl and soothed him at the same time. He ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the food. Back home, his mother used to say that hunger made the soul wild. Maybe that was why the Americans fed them so well, he thought, because a full stomach tamed rebellion. Or maybe a quieter voice inside him whispered, they simply didn't see the point of starving men who'd already lost everything. After breakfast came work detail. Carl was assigned to the machine shop, a long wooden structure that smelled of oil, metal, and sun-baked wood. There, the prisoners repaired farm equipment for local ranchers, tractors, plows, water pumps. The irony wasn't lost on him. Back in Germany, he'd maintained Panzer engines. Now he oiled the gears of a John Deere tractor. But there was comfort in the rhythm of it, the hiss of oil, the scrape of a wrench, the soft thud of hammer on steel. The American overseer, Sergeant Miller, was a tall, quiet man with silver at his temples and eyes the color of the Texas sky. He never raised his voice. He rarely smiled, but he noticed everything. One morning, after Carl adjusted the bearings on a water pump, Miller inspected his work and nodded. "You've got hands that know machines," he said. Carl hesitated, unsure how to respond in English. "Yes, machine is simple, honest." Miller grunted approval. "And world could use more of that." It was a small exchange, but it stayed with Carl for days. Honest. The word rolled around in his mind like a stone in a stream. Back in Dresden, nothing had been honest. Not the speeches, not the promises, not the banners that fluttered red and black above the city. He'd believed in them once, believed in strength, destiny, fatherland. But here, in this strange land of fences and freedom, he found himself surrounded by a quieter, humbler kind of power. One that came from competence, from kindness, from the simple act of doing one's work well. By noon, the air was hot enough to shimmer. The prisoners rested under the shade of an open shed, drinking cool water from tin cups. The Americans sometimes joined them, not out of camaraderie exactly, but out of practicality. Heat erased the lines between victor and vanquished. Sweat made equals of everyone. That afternoon, Carl noticed something unusual near the perimeter fence. A young boy, maybe 10 or 11, was standing outside the wire with a slingshot dangling from his fingers. He was staring at the prisoners, his eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. Carl pretended not to notice, but the boy waved. He hesitated, then lifted his hand in return. The boy grinned and tossed something through the fence, a green apple, small and bruised. It rolled to Carl's boots. For a moment he simply stared at it. The gesture was so simple, so absurd, that it almost broke him. In Europe, children had thrown stones at prisoners. Here they threw fruit. He picked up the apple, brushed off the dust and took a bite. It was tart, sweet, alive with sunlight. Later that night, when the camp settled into quiet and the cicadas began their droning chorus, Carl lay awake staring at the rafters. He thought about the boy, the apple, the cook, the sergeant, the small kindnesses that had accumulated like pebbles in his chest, weighing him down with something dangerously close to hope. He wondered if this was America's true weapon, not its bombs or its armies, but its mercy. A kind of mercy that worked like a machine, steady, methodical, relentless in its quiet way. He turned the thought over in his mind until sleep finally came, and when it did, for the first time in years, he dreamed not of fire, but of sunlight on an open field. The first thing Carl Weiss learned about the camp was that it ran on rules. Not the kind of rules barked by sergeants or printed on propaganda leaflets. These were quiet rules, invisible ones that seemed to flow beneath the surface of daily life like an underground current. Everything had its place. Every man had his task. Every hour had its rhythm. At first, Carl thought it was a trick, another layer of control. But as days folded into weeks, he realized it was something else entirely. The camp wasn't just about keeping prisoners contained. It was about keeping them human. The Americans seemed to believe that order was a form of mercy. Each morning, Sergeant Miller pinned the new work assignments to a wooden board outside the mess hall. The lists were written neatly, typed on paper so white it looked almost fragile. Carl often lingered after breakfast to read the names, even after he knew where he'd been assigned. The precision fascinated him. How every man, every tool, every minute had been catalogued and arranged. It was bureaucracy, yes, but without the cruelty that had always hidden beneath it back home. Once, he asked Miller, "Why all this paper?" "You know who we are." The sergeant looked up from his clipboard, squinting against the sun. "Paper keeps things fair," he said simply. "Paper doesn't care who wins a war." That answer stayed with Carl. In Germany, paper had meant power, permits, orders, deportation lists. Paper had teeth. Here it was gentler. It was a fence made of reason, not fear. But fences still existed. Every evening before the sun dipped below the horizon, the guards walked the perimeter, counting heads. The barbed wire shimmered in the orange light, beautiful and brutal at once. Beyond it, the Texas countryside stretched endlessly, dotted with cattle and windmills. Freedom was close enough to smell. The dry scent of dust and cedar carried on the wind, but it might as well have been another planet. The prisoners rarely talked about escape. What would they escape to? Word traveled fast inside the camp, passed along in whispers after lights out. There were other camps across America, hundreds of them. Some in forests, some in deserts, some near cities with names the Germans could barely pronounce, and all of them, it seemed, were the same, clean, organized, humane. "The Americans," said a grizzled corporal one night, "are too soft to hate us." Another man replied, "No, they're too clever. This," he gestured toward the barracks, the food, the fair treatment. "This is their weapon. They want us to go home and tell everyone that we lost to better men." Carl didn't answer. He couldn't decide whether that was cynicism or wisdom. He spent his evenings in the camp library, a small wooden shack lined with shelves donated by the Red Cross. The books were mostly English, though a few German volumes had been added over time. The librarian, a kindly Swiss civilian named Herr Baumann, wore round spectacles and smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. "You repair machines," Baumann said one evening, handing Carl a book on American farming. "Then you will understand their soul. These people, they love the earth like we love order." Carl opened the book and found photographs, men in wide-brimmed hats standing beside tractors, children playing in wheat fields that stretched forever. The faces were sunburned but smiling, their eyes unburdened. There was a quiet strength there, an ease that he didn't yet have words for. He began reading more, Steinbeck, Whitman, even Lincoln's speeches. The English was slow-going, but the rhythm of the language pulled him forward. It was direct, honest, muscular. It felt true. Each word carved a small crack in the armor he had built around himself. One afternoon, while repairing a tractor axle, Carl cut his palm on a jagged edge of metal. Blood welled up instantly, bright against the dust. He wrapped it with a rag and tried to keep working, but the wound stung sharply. Sergeant Miller noticed. "Let's get that looked at," he said, leading him to the infirmary. The medic, a young woman named Clara, washed the cut with antiseptic that smelled like mint and alcohol. "You're lucky," she said, her voice brisk but kind. "Could have used stitches." Carl winced but didn't flinch. In Germany, no one stops for a little blood. Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why you're here instead of there." It wasn't an insult, but it hit him like one. As she bandaged his hand, Carl found himself studying her face, the calm efficiency, the lack of fear. She treated him not as an enemy, not even as a curiosity, but simply as a man who needed help. For the rest of the day, that small act of care burned in his mind like a slow fire. Later that evening, he caught his reflection in a tin mirror nailed to the barrack wall. The face that looked back at him was thinner, harder, but the eyes were different. Softer, maybe. More uncertain. He thought of his brother back home, who had died in Russia, his body swallowed by the snow. He thought of the speeches they'd memorized, the words about destiny and superiority. And he wondered, for the first time, whether they had ever been strong at all, or just afraid. That night, the guards allowed a small gathering near the mess hall. Someone had found a battered accordion, and a few men began to play. The music drifted through the warm night air, weaving between the barracks like smoke. Carl sat on the steps, listening. The melody was old, something from Bavaria or maybe the Rhine. It rose softly, tentatively, then grew stronger, filling the camp with echoes of home. Even the guards paused their patrols to listen. For a moment, the fences disappeared. When the song ended, silence fell again. But it was a different kind of silence. Not heavy, not hopeless. A silence filled with memory, with the faint hum of something being rebuilt inside each man. Carl realized then that the camp was not simply a prison. It was a mirror. It reflected back everything they had been told to hate, and forced them to see it without the armor of ideology. He looked toward the lights of the guard tower, where Sergeant Miller stood, cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. Their eyes met for a moment through the wire. Miller gave a small nod, nothing more. But it felt like an acknowledgement of something deeper than obedience, a shared understanding that war had ended, but the work of becoming human again had just begun. That night, Carl wrote a single sentence in the small notebook he kept hidden under his mattress. "Mercy is not weakness, it is precision." He didn't know yet what he meant by it, but it felt true. By the third month, the camp no longer felt like a place outside time. It had become a world with its own gravity. The rhythm of life there, at first mechanical, had deepened into something almost organic. Days flowed into each other like long breaths. Carl Weiss still rose early, long before the bugle call. The habit was ingrained. But now, instead of lying awake in restlessness, he found himself watching the sunrise over the far fields, the light spreading slow and deliberate across the Texas plains. It was a sight that never failed to quiet him. There was something immense about it, the way the horizon stretched with no walls, no ruins, no craters, just space and warmth. In that immensity, he began to understand something that no speech or book had ever taught him. That power did not always announce itself with volume. Sometimes it whispered. The machine shop became his sanctuary. Its wooden walls swelled in the heat, creaking softly, and the smell of oil and dust clung to everything. He worked with a kind of reverence, cleaning tools, filing edges, setting each bolt with the exact turn of his wrist. It wasn't about efficiency anymore. It was about craft, about restoring function to broken things. The Americans valued that. When a tractor was fixed, the ranchers who came to collect it would nod respectfully, sometimes even tip their hats. They didn't see enemies. They saw workers, craftsmen, and for Carl, that simple acknowledgement felt like grace. One afternoon, Miller called him aside. "Got a different kind of job for you," he said. "You ever teach before?" Carl shook his head. "Well, you're about to. We got new fellas coming in from Arkansas, don't know a wrench from a wheel bearing." "You'll show 'em how things run," he hesitated. "Me? To teach Americans?" Miller smiled faintly. "To teach Germans. You've got patience." That's rarer than skill. The word startled him. Patience. He had never thought of it as a virtue. In Germany, hesitation had been weakness. You obeyed quickly, acted without question, believed without pause. But here, patience was a kind of quiet power. Over the next weeks, Carl found himself training groups of new prisoners, explaining tools, engines, and the logic of machinery. His English improved by necessity, his voice soft but confident as he demonstrated torque and pressure, the harmony of moving parts. He spoke of machines the way priests spoke of scripture, something pure, predictable, free from deceit. Sometimes, when a repair came together perfectly, he felt a strange stirring, something like prayer. The younger prisoners began to respect him. They sought his advice not only on machines, but on life inside the camp, how to avoid punishment, how to speak to the guards, how to write letters home. Carl never claimed to know much, but his calmness became contagious. The rage that once filled him had slowly burned down into something steadier, like an ember that refused to die out of sheer dignity. Still, not everyone accepted the change. There were men who clung to the old beliefs like drowning sailors clutching to wreckage. One of them, Otto Kranz, was a former SS corporal, sharp-featured and bitter, his loyalty to the Reich unbroken even in defeat. He mocked Carl openly. "You're turning into one of them," Otto sneered one evening as Carl sorted tools. "Look at you, smiling at their guards, fixing their machines, eating their food like a pet dog waiting for scraps." Carl didn't rise to the bait. "Maybe dogs live longer than soldiers," he said quietly. Otto slammed a wrench onto the table. "You're forgetting who you are." Carl looked up, his gaze steady. "No, Otto, I'm remembering." The words hung in the air like heat. Otto stormed off, muttering about traitors, but Carl only exhaled slowly. For the first time he felt unafraid of such accusations. They no longer carried the weight they once had. That night, in the dim barracks, he thought about what it meant to remember. The past had been carved into him, his father's silence after 1918, the endless parades, the speeches that promised glory. He had believed, because belief had been easier than thought. But here, in this camp that ran on fairness and mercy, belief had begun to take a new shape. He had started to believe in function, in balance, in the simple rightness of things working as they should. It wasn't political. It was moral. Sometimes he wondered if that was what America truly was, a machine that worked because its parts, however different, moved in harmony. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't collapse under its own contradictions. There was room for error, for repair. One Sunday, Miller invited a few of the men to attend a church service held outside the camp fence. It wasn't mandatory. Some refused out of pride, others out of disbelief. But Carl went. The chapel was small, whitewashed, the air smelling faintly of cedar and candle wax. Inside, American soldiers sat beside prisoners in the same wooden pews. No one made a spectacle of it. The chaplain, an old man with a voice like weathered oak, spoke not of victory but of mercy. To forgive, he said, is not to forget. It is to choose the future over the past. The words fell into Carl's mind like stones into deep water. He didn't understand faith, not in the way this man meant it, but he understood the machinery of that sentence. To choose the future over the past. That was an act of engineering, of will. When they returned to camp, the sun was setting. The sky flared in pink and gold, the wire fences glowing faintly in the light. For the first time, Carl didn't see the wire as a prison. He saw it as part of a larger design, temporary, necessary, not meant to last. That night he opened his notebook again and wrote, "Machines can be repaired. So can men." As the days passed, he began to notice things he had once ignored. The guards rotated duties, so no one became cruel from boredom. The Red Cross truck arrived on schedule, its crates of supplies marked with careful handwriting. The Americans even allowed the prisoners to hold elections for their own camp representatives. It astonished him, the trust in it, the assumption that order could be maintained without fear. He realized that what he was seeing was not mercy born of sentiment, but mercy built like a system, structured, intentional, engineered. And that was when the phrase first came to him. Unbidden, clear as glass, the machinery of mercy. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Carl walked to the fence line and watched the light turn gold across the plains. The sky seemed endless, open enough to hold every regret, every possibility. He thought of the machines he had repaired, the engines that hummed again, the gears that meshed after months of neglect. Each one, he realized, was a metaphor for what had happened inside him. You could rebuild, if you knew the parts. You could make something work again, if you were willing to touch the broken pieces without fear. He reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded the scrap of red and white checkered cloth the cook had given him, a piece of the mess hall tablecloth. He held it to the fading light. The wind caught it, fluttering like a small flag, red and white, the colors of surrender and hope. Carl smiled faintly. For the first time he believed in both. The ship that carried Carl Weiss back across the Atlantic was grey and unadorned, a former troop carrier now filled with men who were no longer soldiers. The sea stretched endlessly, an iron mirror beneath a pallid sky. Some of the passengers played cards, some slept. Others stared silently at the horizon, as if trying to measure the distance between what had been and what might come. Carl stood by the railing most days, his hands wrapped around the cold metal, the wind in his face. He had imagined this moment countless times during captivity, homecoming, reunion, redemption. But now that it was here, it felt like a dream that had already begun to fade. The ocean was vast, but not cruel. It moved with a rhythm that reminded him of breath, of the slow work of living. He thought of the machine shop in Texas, of the clang of wrenches and the smell of oil, of the laughter that had begun to sound like music. He thought of Miller's last words. Building's harder than fighting. He wondered if the same could be said for living. When the ship docked in Bremerhaven, the air smelled of ash and salt. The docks were half collapsed, cranes leaning like drunks. German officers no longer stood waiting with crisp salutes, only Red Cross workers. Their uniforms marked with neutral symbols, guiding the returnees through lines for rations and paperwork. Carl carried no luggage. Only the clothes on his back, his worn boots, and the small notebook from the camp, its cover smudged with oil and sweat. The road to Dresden was long and almost unrecognizable. The train tracks twisted like ribs through scorched fields. Villages had become skeletons of brick and timber. Sometimes he saw children standing beside the tracks, their faces pale and watchful, holding out tin cups in hope. He gave what little he had, a piece of bread, a smile, a word in his own tongue that suddenly felt foreign. When at last the train reached Dresden, it was evening. Smoke still rose from the ruins, though the bombing had ended months ago. The city was a ghost of itself, streets lined with hollowed buildings, cathedrals gutted to the sky. The Elbe River glimmered faintly in the dying light, winding through rubble like a memory of movement. Carl walked the streets slowly, careful of the debris. He found the remains of the street where his family had lived. The house was gone, its foundation a pit of dust and charred beams. Only the front step remained, cracked but solid. He sat on it, his hands resting on his knees, listening to the silence that filled the air like fog. For a long time he didn't move. He simply breathed. When he finally rose, he saw an old woman approaching, her face lined deeply but kind. She stopped when she saw him. "You're back," she said softly. Carl blinked. "Frau Heller?" She smiled faintly. "You remember," he nodded. She had lived next door once before the world ended. "Your mother?" she asked gently. "She wrote to me. From Leipzig." "I'll go to her," Frau Heller nodded, her eyes glistening. "She will be glad. There is too much death here." Carl looked around. "And yet it lives." She studied him a moment, then said, "You sound changed." "I suppose I am." She touched his sleeve. "Then keep it, whatever it is. The world will need new kinds of men." Leipzig was less destroyed, but the scars were everywhere. Walls pocked with shrapnel, bridges half rebuilt, people moving like ghosts between queues for bread. Carl found his mother in a small apartment that had once been a classroom. She was thinner, her hair entirely grey, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Carl," she whispered, her hands trembling. "My boy." He held her, and for the first time in years felt something unclench inside him. The scent of her, soap, wool, age, cut through every memory of barracks and oil. They sat together that night, eating soup slowly, speaking in fragments. She told him about the air raids, the hunger, the neighbors lost or displaced. He told her about Texas, the camp, the men, the fields. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he spoke of the Americans' fairness, of the strange gentleness of captivity, her eyes softened. "Mercy," she said quietly. "Perhaps that is their victory," Carl nodded. "It's what saved me." After a pause, she asked, "Do you hate them?" He thought for a long time before answering. "No, I don't think I know how to hate anymore." She reached out and took his hand. "Then you have learned more than any war could teach." The next months passed in slow labor. The city began to rebuild, timber rising from ash, bricks stacked by hand. Carl joined a team repairing generators at a local factory. The machines were old, scavenged from ruins, their belts frayed and gears misaligned. But he worked the way he had in the camp, with care, with patience, with faith in function. He taught younger men how to repair what seemed beyond repair. He spoke of alignment, of balance, of respecting each piece for the role it played. Every machine, he told them, is a conversation between its parts. If one refuses to listen, the whole breaks. Sometimes, when the workday ended, he would stand outside the factory and watch the smoke drift into the evening sky. It no longer looked like destruction. It looked like breath. In early autumn, he received a letter written in English. The envelope was stamped U.S. Army Post. It was from Sergeant Miller. "Carl, I hope this finds you well. I'm back home in Kansas, fixing tractors again. Funny how the world folds back to what it was, but a little wiser each time. I wanted to thank you for your work and your patience. I tell folks here about the Germans I met, and they don't believe me when I say you were good men. Maybe someday they will. Maybe someday you'll visit this place again and see it, not from behind a fence, but from a porch. Until then, keep building. Miller Carl read it 3 times. He smiled, then placed it carefully inside his notebook beside his mother's last letter. That night, he walked to the edge of the city, where the land opened into fields. The stars were visible again, unbroken by smoke. He could hear crickets, the faint hum of generators, the steady pulse of work and life returning. He thought of the phrase that had come to him months before, the machinery of mercy. Now he understood its final piece. Mercy was not only something received, but something given forward. A system could endure only if its compassion circulated, gear to gear, soul to soul. If hatred was entropy, then mercy was motion. Years passed. Germany changed. Borders redrew, economies rose and fell, and the world spun on with its new inventions and its old mistakes. Carl grew older too, his hands calloused, his hair silver. He married, quietly, to a woman who worked beside him in the factory. They had no children, but their home was warm and full of music. He kept his tools well oiled. He never stopped repairing things. Sometimes he dreamed of Texas. In his dreams, the camp was not a prison, but a workshop, bright with sun and laughter, the sound of hammers blending with birdsong. He would wake with the smell of oil in his nose and the faint taste of bacon on his tongue. He never forgot the lesson he had learned there, that discipline could serve mercy as surely as it once served tyranny. That order, without cruelty, was the skeleton of peace. When the factory introduced a training program for apprentices, Carl volunteered to teach. He told them stories, not of war, but of machines, of patience, of listening. Once a young man asked him, "Herr Weiss, what was it like to lose the war?" Carl paused, setting down his wrench. "It was like waking from a long, dangerous dream," he said. "Painful but necessary," the young man frowned. "And the Americans? Were they cruel?" Carl smiled. "No, they were merciful. And mercy," he said softly, "is harder than cruelty. It takes more strength." Many years later, when Carl was old and the world had changed beyond recognition, he visited the Dresden rebuilt. The cathedral stood again, its stones newly carved, but still bearing the soot of the past. Children played in the square, their laughter bright and careless. He sat on a bench, the sun warm on his face, and watched them. Nearby, a man repaired a bicycle chain for a little girl. The motion was familiar, the patience, the precision, the care. Carl felt something rise in his chest, a quiet joy, and he realized that the work he had done, the mercy he had witnessed, had not been in vain. It had traveled forward, invisible but alive, like oil through the gears of time. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the same piece of red and white, checkered cloth he had kept all those years. It was faded now, frayed at the edges. He laid it on his knee, smoothing it gently, red for blood, white for peace. Together, they made something that endured, as the bells of the rebuilt church rang out across the square. Carl Weiss closed his eyes and smiled. He thought of a phrase from a long-ago camp, of engines and mercy, of men and their machines. "Building's harder than fighting," Miller had said, and Carl even now knew it was true. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a truth. This camp, this country ran on it. Every rule, every kindness, every scrap of fairness was a gear in the greater mechanism. And somehow, without realizing it, he had become part of its motion. One evening, as the light faded, Carl stood outside the workshop. The wind moved through the tall grass, whispering softly. Beyond the fence, a train whistle echoed across the plains. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash through him, a sound not of war, but of continuation. For the first time, he felt a quiet certainty. He would survive this. Not just in body, but in soul. Spring came to Texas quietly that year. It did not burst in with color or song, but crept slowly across the land, tinting the grass green again, softening the hard edges of winter. The mornings turned warmer, the air gentler. The camp no longer smelled of smoke or iron, but of tilled earth and fresh hay carried in from the nearby ranches. By now, Carl Weiss had been in America long enough to forget the exact rhythm of his days before. He no longer thought of time as since capture or until release. There was simply the present, the work, the sunrise, the sound of tools on metal, the hum of the radio, the laughter that sometimes slipped between men who had once been strangers or enemies. He had stopped counting days. The mind, he realized, could not heal while it was still tallying the loss. The work detail that month involved mending the engines of irrigation pumps for the farms beyond the camp. The guards barely watched them now, sitting under the shade of cottonwood trees with their hats over their faces. Trust had become so ordinary that it was almost invisible. Carl liked those days. He and the men would ride out in open trucks, past endless rows of cotton and corn, the air thick with the scent of soil. The land seemed to breathe, a slow, generous exhale. One afternoon, while he worked beneath the hood of a pump engine, he looked up and saw a boy standing at the fence line. Barefoot, maybe 10 years old, wearing overalls a size too big. The boy watched him curiously. When their eyes met, he smiled shyly and lifted a canteen through the wire. "Water, mister?" he asked. Carl hesitated, then nodded. The water was cool, clean, sweeter than anything he'd tasted in months. He handed the canteen back, his fingers brushing the boy's. "Danke," he said softly. The boy looked puzzled, then grinned. "You talk funny," Carl laughed. It was a small sound, but it surprised even him. "So do you," he replied in halting English. The boy shrugged and pointed toward the ranch beyond. "My pa says you're all helping with the pumps." "Says you work good," Carl nodded. "We try." The boy considered that, then said, "Pa says war's over soon. Maybe you go home." Carl looked toward the horizon. The sky was a pale, washed blue, vast and merciless in its beauty. "Maybe," he said. But even as he said it, he realized he no longer knew where home was. Dresden. It existed now only in letters, in the fragile memory of a mother's handwriting, and a city turned to ash. Home had become an idea, not a place. A sense of belonging that had begun to form here among fences and strangers. That night, he lay on his cot and reread his mother's letter for the 100th time. "We are alive. Dresden is gone." The words no longer stung. They had become a rhythm in his mind, a mantra of survival. Outside, the wind rattled the loose panels of the barracks. Somewhere, a harmonica played, a slow, wistful tune. It wasn't German or American. It was just human. 2 weeks later, the Red Cross truck arrived again. It was always an event. Something between a holiday and a sermon. The men gathered by the gate, restless and eager. The Americans unloaded sacks of mail and a few boxes of supplies. One of the guards, a tall man with kind eyes, sorted the envelopes and called out names. When he said Weiss, Carl, a small cheer went up among the prisoners. Carl smiled awkwardly, taking the envelope as though it were made of glass. Inside, his mother's handwriting wavered but remained legible. "My dear Carl, the Americans have built kitchens in the ruins. They give bread and milk to the children. They say the war is ending. Some of our neighbors have returned from camps, thin, broken but alive. I do not know what the future is, but I know you are alive and that is enough." Carl read it again and again. The idea of Americans feeding Germans still felt impossible, like the world had turned itself inside out. Yet sitting there under the Texas sun, surrounded by men in worn uniforms, he understood what his mother meant. Survival itself was a kind of forgiveness. When he looked up, he saw Otto sitting apart, staring at his own unopened envelope. His hands shook slightly. Carl hesitated, then walked over and sat beside him. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. Otto's mouth twitched. "No news," he said. "And that's worse." They sat in silence for a while. The air buzzed with cicadas, the hum of life continuing, indifferent and eternal. Finally, Otto muttered, "What do you think will happen to us? When we go back?" Carl folded his letter carefully. "We rebuild." Otto shook his head. "Rebuild what?" "There's nothing left," Carl thought for a moment. "Then we start from nothing." That's what the Americans did once, didn't they? They lost a war, too. Their own long ago. But they built again. Otto gave him a doubtful look. "You think we can become like them?" "No," Carl said. "But maybe we can learn from them. The war taught us how to destroy. Perhaps now we must learn how to build. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't meant to be. But Otto said nothing after that. And when the work bell rang, he followed Carl to the shop without protest. A few nights later, the camp loudspeaker crackled with static. Then a familiar American voice announced the news. Berlin has fallen. Hitler is dead. The words dropped into the room like stones. No one moved. Carl felt something shift inside him. Not triumph, not grief, just an immense, exhausted silence. It was over. The empire that had demanded his faith, his obedience, his years, had vanished like smoke. He walked outside. The evening sky glowed orange, not from fire but from sunset. The air was still. Somewhere, a horse neighed, and from the mess hall drifted the smell of bacon again. Sweet, absurdly comforting. He closed his eyes and let the scent fill him. Once, it had represented mockery. Now, it was simply breakfast, simply peace. When he opened his eyes again, he noticed the guard from the shop, Sergeant Miller, standing beside him. Guess it's over, Miller said quietly. Carl nodded. Yes, for us maybe. Miller tilted his head. You think it starts again somewhere else? Carl gave a faint smile. Maybe, but not the same way. They stood in silence, watching the sun disappear. Finally, Miller said, You did good work here, Carl, real good. Don't forget that when you go home. Building's harder than fighting, Carl met his gaze. I won't forget. And he meant it. When morning came, the guards didn't line them up by rank or number. They simply said, You are no longer prisoners. You are guests until transport. Some men wept openly. Others stared blankly, hollowed out by disbelief. Carl sat at the long table, staring at his tin cup of coffee. It tasted the same as yesterday's, but it felt different. Freedom had altered its flavor. That day, the mess hall served bacon again. Perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps it was ritual, the closing of a circle. The same cook who'd first greeted Carl months ago grinned as he flipped the sizzling strips on the griddle. Morning, partner, he said again, just as before. Carl smiled. Morning. When he bit into the bacon, he didn't think of propaganda or pity. He thought of his mother's letter. Americans feeding Germans, and for the first time, he understood it completely. It wasn't food that had changed him, it was what the food represented. Abundance without arrogance. Mercy without weakness. Power without cruelty. That was the machinery of mercy in motion.